the issue with the barges, how does Scenic Hudson see this? And exactly how would you describe what's going on and what's at stake here?
Well, from Scenic Hudson's perspective, we look at this from 2 points of view. One is procedurally and the other one is substantively. So starting with the procedure, what has happened is the United States Coast Guard has issued what's called an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking. It's very early in the process. It's subject to public review and comment. Basically what the Coast Guard has done is sort of put out feelers to the public with regard to these potential new anchorages up and down the river to see what people have to say about that and to identify any potential impacts. So this is very early on in the process. You can find out information about that in the Federal Register. It's published online. Both the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking is there, along with some background materials, including some communications from industry where the request to establish these anchorages came from. And public comment is not due until September the 7th, so they're accepting written comment. We, along with some other entities, including Riverkeeper, and I think some of the affected municipalities, have requested a public meeting. So far we have not seen notice of that, but we are hoping to see that soon. So that's the procedure. And then in terms of substance, we are also very early on at Scenic Hudson in our analysis of this. What came out with the rule is some meets and bounds description of the proposed anchorages areas. We're looking at that with regard to significant habitat sites, where exactly they're located, what natural resources might potentially be impacted, what kind of technology might be used to either create permanent anchorages or how the boats would be doing that. So we're still really early on in our analysis and trying to formulate a position, but we definitely do plan to be submitting comments and we will likely attend the public meeting to find out more information and make our views known.
In terms of environmental impact, I mean, what specifically concerns you with these tankers?
Well, actually, you know, it's barge anchorages. I think that they could be used for all kinds of tankers. I think the expected use is by the crude oil barges. So, of course, potential spill risk into the Hudson River of the crude that's being carried is one of the main concerns of Scenic Hudson, because that would be a direct and devastating impact. Of course, impacts on viewshed to the adjacent lands, things like light, noise, and again, spill impacts are something that we are concerned with. The impacts to the bottom of the river itself, depending on the kind of tackle that the boats will be using to anchor themselves, or if some sort of permanent anchorage is going to be proposed. That's another thing we're concerned with. And I think from a boating perspective, maybe safety. You know, I grew up here in the Hudson Valley. I went to Roosevelt High School. I was a rower when I was a kid, and I remember the biggest fear, both when I was a rower and a coach, was if a barge came by and the big wake came by. And because you're out there in a very small, thin boat, what you had to do was stop rowing and align yourself with the wake from the barge to make sure that it would roll safely underneath you. It was something that we always had to keep an eye out for, in addition to, you know, the pleasure boater and other commercial traffic. So there could be potential safety issues.
The tackle issue, let's talk about that. I understand that there's concern about the waterbed in terms of sturgeons spawning. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit about the sturgeon issue?
Actually, that's something that we are still looking into. At Scenic Hudson, we have a conservation science department. So I'm just an attorney, a staff attorney at Scenic Hudson. So what I do is I rely on my experts for that kind of information. And to tell you the truth, this advanced notice of proposed rulemaking is pretty short on information. Other than the actual physical locations, there's not really much information about how exactly the barges and the boats will be making their anchorages and the exact impact that it would have. But yes, you're right, in terms of those actual physical impacts, it would be, you know, to the substrate itself, the things that are already there, but also potential impacts to sturgeon habitat. And another thing that just recently happened, and I don't know if the federal agencies are speaking to each other, but NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, also just recently issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. And back when they listed the sturgeon in the river as endangered species, they promised to also set out criteria for designating the habitat for those species. And so NOAA just recently put out its criteria for habitat designation. And so, you know, one of the questions that I'll be asking my experts in the conservation science is, okay, are any of these locations of proposed anchorages going to be in where we might actually have habitat as per those designated criteria? So I think the federal agencies need to check in with each other on those potential, you know, impacts or conflicts.
Diane McCord, who is the town supervisor for Esopus,
Mm-hmm.
who we're going to talk to a little later, has mentioned at the Port Ewan's site
Mm-hmm.
that the water intake is there. The water
Okay.
valve is there.
Right.
In fact, it supplies water to some 4,500 people.
Right.
And that's right behind you there. Is there any thought about that risk to actual water intake and water treatment?
Yes, definitely, of course. I mean, adding to the list of, you know, physical impacts, visual impacts, you know, having a water intake like that is, you know, extremely critical. So, you know, depending on the materials that are being held in the barge, like I mentioned, one of our main concerns is the potential for a crude oil spill. So something like that would be devastating. You know, for instance, another impact that we suffer from here in the Hudson Valley is the rail trains that come through carrying crude oil. And when there was a derailment and a spill of that into the James River in Lynchburg, Virginia, which would be, you know, another worst case scenario here on the river, they shut down the water intake for the local municipality. And that would have to happen if there was a spill from one of the barges here, and that would be, you know, a big impact to the town of Esopus or anyone else where it occurred.
And in terms of the journeys that these barges and tugboats take, has there been an increase in this in recent years? I mean, is there more traffic? And in terms of also the crude oil, is there a difference between the oil that's being transported now and what used to be?
Well, this is an extremely complicated and integrated topic. You know, the energy industry, as we all know, there's been a sea change in the production of crude oil here in the United States with the discovery of the Bakken Formation and the Bakken crude that comes out of there through fracking. That's an extremely volatile light crude, and what's been happening is that's been loaded into rail cars and it's transported to the Port of Albany, and there it's transloaded into barges that are coming south to refineries in Linden. So taking a look at that sort of boom in Bakken crude, there is a proposed pipeline that's going to be coming down the thruway if all goes well for the applicant, but that would also carry Bakken crude. And one of the reasons why the proponent of that double pipeline, which would carry crude south and refined products north, one of the reasons why they're trying to justify that pipeline is they say we're going to take barges off the river. So, you know, who knows? We are opposed to that pipeline project, so, you know, it's our hope that that isn't actually built. And then the other thing is there is a second kind of crude oil coming from Alberta and the tar sands, and there is an application currently pending for a facility that's up in the Port of Albany. And what they want to do, the global companies want to be able to heat tar sands so that when that comes in by rail, they can then transload it onto barges. So it seems to be that sort of all of the players in the industry, whether it's a stationary transloading facility or it's the you know, the rail transporting companies, or it's the barging companies, or it's the refineries where the crude oil is going, they're all trying to predict what's going to happen and position themselves to best take advantage of that. So it might be the case that you know, the industry who has made this request for anchorages are hoping to capture a large amount of that market and do the transporting as opposed to the pipeline or the rail cars. So it's all about the finances.
Yeah, always. Okay, so I'm going to read you something that was said by a spokesperson for the Coast Guard in
Okay.
Boston. She said, "It's just like driving a big rig truck. You're under stress and time is money. Companies want to drive through, but that's not safe. There needs to be a safe place for them to drop the hook for the night and then continue on their voyage, especially when there's ice on the river and then it's an even slower transit. Now, John Lipscomb with the River Keepers has called some of these into question. Do you have any reaction to that statement? Why do they need to stop and set anchor? Is that really making things safer?
Well, I guess, like I said, industry will, come up with the best arguments that they can to justify the proposal that they want to make in the interest of capturing market share. And if safety is one of the justifications that they can come up with, then, they're going to claim that that's the case, that I guess stopping anchor helps in terms of fatigue of maybe the barge captains or something like that. So, that might be a legitimate concern, but it also seems that, with the reduction in crude oil prices and the movement more towards renewable fuels, I don't know how the fossil fuel industry is reacting to things, but there might be more of a slowdown of this material moving up and down the river, and so it might be that the barges or whoever's running them are trying to position themselves optimally to kind of capture when something finally does come into the Port of Albany or a refined product is available. So I think it might be partially safety, but it might also be partially sort of just the logistics of transport and, the idea that they can kind of stop somewhere and position themselves optimally. I'm not sure I can speculate any further on that, but, industry will say what they can to try and justify what it is that they want.
Certainly will. Okay. What do you think about the timing of all this? Because my understanding is that there's been a lot of outcry from you, from right here in Rhinebeck, our town supervisor Elizabeth Spinzia, county executives on both sides of the river, people on the other side,
right.
Up and down the river, have been looking for a public meeting, a public hearing.
Correct.
Without, has Scenic Hudson gotten a response about a public meeting on here?
Like I said, no, we haven't seen anything yet. So again, we've been sort of monitoring the Federal Register that's available online, where the proposed, the advance notice of proposed rulemaking and some background materials are. So we've kind of been watching. The deadline for people to request a public meeting was back on June 30th, and Scenic Hudson submitted a letter along with Riverkeeper, represented by the Pace Litigation Clinic, and I know that others have done so as well. And I think that a U.S. Coast Guard representative had acknowledged that public meetings are planned, but thus far we have not actually seen formal notice of when and where those might take place.
Yeah, I guess my question is this, a little more specifically. If they posted this as the deadline was June 30th, at what point did they post the notice that this rule change was going to be reviewed? In other words, how much time was there actually for the public and for government officials to call for a public meeting? Unless it's next year in 2017.
I'm not sure I understand your question. The advance notice of proposed rulemaking, I don't recall off the top of my head the exact date that it came out, and then there was some period of time up until June 30th when you could make the request for a public meeting, and quite a few people met that deadline. So the U.S. Coast Guard does have in hand a request for a public meeting, and I think that one of their representatives has orally, recognize that they are going to hold that. So it's just a matter of noticing that, and then however many days it's going to be until the actual date of the meeting occurs. So I think that, we can only hope that the Coast Guard has seen that there's already been significant public interest and response to this, and that they will, do a good job of giving the notice and also give a sufficient amount of time for people to develop the comments that they will be making at the public meeting, in addition to written comments, which are due on September the 7th. So, and one thing we can always do if we feel that the notice was insufficient or the amount of time to prepare for the public meeting is insufficient is to submit a request to the Coast Guard to, push that off or hold another meeting, hold them at various areas all up and down the river so that people and the public can really have a valid opportunity to be heard.
Great. Okay, just the last couple of questions.
Sure.
You started off in private practice for some time, and then you chose to come to Scenic Hudson.
That's correct.
Which is a public interest, a major public interest group. What motivated you to do that?
Well, actually, it wasn't a motivation that arose at some point during my time in private practice. I actually went to law school in the interest of doing environmental advocacy work. It's why I chose Pace Law School. I participated in the litigation clinic. I interned for Riverkeeper while I was there. So public interest environmental law is what I always wanted to do. It was just a matter of sort of taking the job that was available to me when I graduated. And so, like I said, I was in private practice for 10 years. I represented private clients for a while, and then I spent quite a few years representing municipalities where I did a lot of land use, zoning, planning, and municipal law, and really gained a lot of valuable experience, I think, in terms of what the localities here in the Hudson Valley are concerned with, and our local leaders, and the great job that they try to do to protect their residents and make sure that the public interest is protected. So, but eventually when a position opened up at Scenic Hudson where the title was Land Use and Environmental Advocacy Attorney, I said, that's me, and applied for the job and luckily got it, and I've been there for a little over 2 years and very happy to be there and do this work.
It's great that you're there. What would you say for the municipalities all up and down the Hudson River? How important is the life and the health of the river itself in your experience when it comes to issues that they look at and try to deal? How would you rate the river itself?
Well, this river is designated an American Heritage River. So in terms of a federal designation, it's way up high there. I think that the federal government has recognized the value of this river. I mean, from a historical perspective, it has no equal. You know, this was ground zero where America was discovered, the revolution was fought, and I think the history here, I mean, the agriculture, the tourism, the beauty, the natural resources, the biodiversity, there's really no equal to this river. And I think that our municipalities that are all up and down recognize that as they move towards, you know, local waterfront revitalization plans, really trying to maintain access to the river. But if we're talking about federal designations, on the one hand, we have this significant and great designation as an American Heritage River, but we also still have a designation as a Superfund site. The Hudson River is a 200-mile-long hazardous waste site from, you know, up there where GE was all the way down to the battery. And so we're still fighting to make sure that GE does its job and gets all of the PCBs out of the river up there that it needs to in order to help to return the Hudson River back to the vitality that it had, the commercial fishery, that you can go down to the river's edge and pull a fish out of it and actually eat it, because right now you can't do that. There's health advisories against that. I remember when I was a kid rowing on the river, I'd get home from practice and I smelled pretty bad. It's not that bad today. I just did a triathlon down in New York City in the Hudson River. I probably wouldn't have been able to do that 20 years ago. So our river is getting better. Our localities and municipalities are taking advantage of that, pulling the economic and the beautiful resources out of it. But the fight isn't over yet. We need to keep going. And these anchorages are part of that.
Okay, and just finally as a statement to our viewers, in terms of what they can do between now and September, could you just sort of address directly, you know, all people that live in this region and love and care about our river?
Sure.
What they can do?
Well, the first thing that you would need to do is educate yourself, both about the process and the information that's available. So again, I would direct people to the Federal Register, where they can see the advance notice of proposed rulemaking. It's very fine print. It looks very dense, but it's actually not that much information. It is organized, and you can see from there what it is that's being proposed. Also on that website, there are background materials. I would take a look at those. You can sort of see the history and what it is that precipitated this advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And then procedurally, have a look out for the notice of when those public meetings are going to be held, and definitely attend those to learn more information, ask questions of the Coast Guard, and you can most likely be able to make a statement at that time. And then there's a deadline of September the 7th of this year for written comments. So I would say educate yourself, see where these anchorages are proposed for, go down to the water's edge and imagine what it might be like if there are large tankers anchored there, and what the impacts will be to your river and your municipality. And then submit your comments and make sure your voice is heard.
Action.
Rhinebeck adopted a comprehensive plan in 2009, and
Right.
as part of that, we have an LWRP, a local waterfront revitalization plan, so we're designated.
Right.
And what the LWRP does for us is it gives us federal and state protection. A lot for things that have to do with this river, you know, for view shed, for water cleanliness, for the habitats here. Am I correct in assuming that it's both a federal and a state protection level?
Correct. A local LWRP actually originates at the federal level with the Coastal Zone Consistency Act. That's delegated to the states to implement. And what happens is municipalities will propose an LWRP, the state signs off on it, and now it's within the hands of the municipality to implement it. And usually what it entails is you can pick from a menu of 40 criteria. So if and when somebody proposes a project or an action or something within the designated LWRP area of your municipality, you pick out of those 40 criteria and say, okay, this is applicable to Rhinebeck, and we now have them as criteria in our local code. And so one of the things that the town can definitely, and I would suggest definitely do, is if and when you make comments to the Coast Guard with regard to these proposed anchorages, is you take a look at them.
Oh, yes.
And you apply the criteria from your LWRP as well as your any other applicable
Which is
local
what
code,
we
and
do
include
here
that in
for
your comments.
all
Right.
of our zoning, especially in this hamlet, you know, Rhinecliff, all of the land
Right.
here just west of River Road and Morton Road is a historic district. There's no zoning by right here,
Okay.
even in this historic hamlet. Everything has to go through the LWRP review.
Right, and the historic designation gives you yet another
Yes.
layer of commenting that you can say, and you can say, take a look at it. What are these proposed anchorages? What are the possible impacts? And is it consistent with these criteria in your LWRP? And issue that opinion with regard to that, since you guys are obviously the experts with regard to your local jurisdiction, and then send that on to the Coast Guard, and it needs to consider it if it is going to move forward with a proposed rule for anchorages. This advanced rule has 10 proposed locations. Who knows if they, plan to do all of them? The best part is if we could stop it in its tracks right
Absolutely.
here.
I mean, we have 350 acres just across from Rhinecliff. You know, I think 279 and Kingston and another 70 in Esopus.
Yeah, these are
It's
huge
critical.
areas.
Critical.
Yeah. Huge areas, and each one of those anchorages has a different length of time that the boats can stay, the swing area, the number of boats that can be there, the size of the boats can be there. So there's a lot of details to digest and really consider what the potential impacts of that will be, and then apply your local code to it.
Thanks.
I agree.
Thank you.